In today's episode, we're going to be planting tomatoes, and I'm going to give you all my tips and tricks to growing the best tomatoes this year. We're also going to be preserving and canning kumquats, and I'm going to give you all of my advice on preserving bountiful harvests when you have just a little bit too much. We're going to be planting tomatoes. The very first step in preparing this raised bed is clearing out any weeds. And some of these aren't necessarily conventional weeds. They're just things that I don't want to be growing in this raised bed that will ultimately compete with my tomatoes. So I'm just going to pull these out. And springtime, it's really hard to stay on top of the weeds, but if you can, try to, because they will compete with your crops. So these are daffodils here, and you want to make sure you get the root out as well. And if you need a little extra help getting the weeds out, you can use a tool like this. This is a hori-hori, it's a garden knife. And I'm just going to put these into my bucket. The chickens actually really love daffodils, so we'll be sharing with those. And then these weeds here aren't really weeds, they're called borage, but they grow like a weed in my garden. They produce beautiful, edible blue flowers that bees love. And then also the leaves are edible, but it grows all over my garden, so I'm not too worried about removing that. And today we're gonna be planting a variety of tomato called 4th of July. So 4th of July is a hybrid variety, and there are two types of tomatoes. There are indeterminate and determinate varieties. So the difference between the two is determinate varieties of tomatoes all set fruit at the same time, and typically all the tomatoes ripen at the same time. This is pretty good for if you're trying to can or preserve your tomatoes. So those will all ripen at the same time, making it pretty easy and convenient to can them all at once. And then an indeterminate variety is kind of like ever-bearing throughout the season, and it will continuously grow and ripen throughout the season. So those are really good for snacking or making salads or just harvesting what you need as you go. The variety today is an indeterminate variety, and the name 4th of July is such because it will ripen, or the first tomatoes are said to have ripened by 4th of July. So it is kind of like an early variety of tomato. And so far, I'm pretty impressed with this variety because it is the most vigorously growing one that I've started this year. And I think I started this one on February 1st. And I started some other varieties in January, and they're not as large as this one. So it's a quick growing variety, it's hybrid, and it produces tomatoes that are about that big. All right, so I got my weeds pulled out here. And the next thing I'm gonna do is push a lot of this mulch to the side for now. And then we're gonna top off the soil level with a really good potting soil mix as well as compost. So if you're new here, this is my favorite brand. It's a little bit pricey. It's called Booze Blend, and I like their potting soil and their compost, and we're gonna be spreading this out on this side of the raised bed. I always like to make sure that my soil levels are topped off at the beginning of each season, mainly because the soil levels will naturally fall or decline throughout the season. And then if you think that your garden needs a little extra boost, sometimes I like to use this organic fertilizer. It's called Dr. Earth Homegrown Organic and Natural Tomato, Vegetable, and Herb Fertilizer. And I actually grew tomatoes in this raised bed last year, and I don't have any open spots in my garden currently because my early spring and late winter crops are still growing. So I do want to amend it with just a little bit of this fertilizer, just because I'm going back to back with tomatoes, and typically I like to crop rotate. So for just mixing into the topsoil, it's a little bit different than if you were to be fertilizing an established plant. So per 10 square feet of growing area, you want to mix in about a cup of this. This is going to be about 10 square feet, so we're going to do a cup of this because the raised bed is 40 square feet and we're only planting 1/4 of this. So the right time to plant tomatoes depends on where you live. So a good rule of thumb is that you want daytime temperatures to be at 60 degrees or above consistently with no frost in sight, and nighttime temperatures to be at about above 50 degrees. And we're gonna dig a little bit larger of a hole than you may think, because we're gonna plant the tomatoes fairly deep. And we're gonna plant these about 1.5 feet apart. I personally like to grow them somewhat close together so that I can maximize my space, but that means that you have to prune them a little bit more often. So thinking about your time commitment and what you kind of want to do, that'll dictate how far apart you plant your tomatoes. So this is just a skewer that I was using to help kind of prop these up as I was hardening them off. So tomatoes are pretty resilient when it comes to transplanting. So you'll see here, I'm gonna gently nudge this out and you can see all of the roots that are growing here. And I'm just gonna separate the two seedlings that are here and kind of do it gently. They kind of will untangle from one another. And along the tomato, you'll see all these fuzzy little hairs. So those are all potential roots that can root down. So you can actually plant your tomato, not down here, but much higher. We're gonna plant it right below these first 2 leaves. So these were the first leaves that come out when a seed germinates. These are the first true leaves. So we're gonna plant it right below those first germination leaves. I just love the smell of tomato leaf. I know last year there was a couple of brands that made tomato scented candles or tomato leaf scented candles. So that might be a fun thing to try and recreate ourselves. And that's about it when it comes to planting a tomato. So I planted these or started these on February 1st. We're actually planting these today on March 1st. And I typically like to transplant my tomatoes on March 15th here in Los Angeles, Southern California, Zone 10B. But we're gonna get a little bit of a head start. We've had some nice warm weather. And this variety has outgrown all the other ones. I had to harden it off much quicker. It outgrew the grow light that was inside. So I would recommend this variety so far, but we'll see how much fruit it actually produces for us. So again, digging a hole that is deeper than what we think. Gonna hold that in place and gently backfill with our amended soil. And then you can see I'm using like my hori-hori here to measure how far apart. So this is a foot long, and I kind of just go one and kind of a little bit more than 1 foot. When it comes to tomatoes, there are a couple of problems that are pretty common. So one of those is pests. And so common pests for tomatoes are typically aphids and hornworms. So with aphids, you want to try and catch that early on. And one of the things that you can do with aphids is introduce beneficial predators, so things like ladybugs or lacewings. When it comes to hornworms, you just want to be vigilant and try and catch them early. Also with aphids, you could use something like a organic neem oil spray, or even like just a soapy, mild soap dilution in a spray bottle with a Castile soap dilution. Another common problem with tomatoes is something called blossom end rot. So blossom end rot is when your tomatoes are growing seemingly all right and the flowers are fine. It's when the fruit sets, the bottom of the tomato gets somewhat rotten looking, so blossom end rot. So the top of the tomato looks fine, but the bottom of it looks like it's rotting out. And that can be from either inconsistent watering, so maybe you're just flooding your tomatoes and then they go really dry. So you want to make sure you are getting consistent watering to these tomatoes. And then the other thing could be a calcium deficiency. So one of the ways to introduce calcium would be through a calcium specific fertilizer, or even like crushing up eggshells could also help with some of the calcium in your soil. But in order to determine that, you would want to get your soil tested to make sure that that is what the problem is before introducing fertilizers. Always make sure I add my plant label. So this whole side is going to be 4th of July tomatoes. So I'm going to put that right in the middle. And then I like to companion plant tomatoes with basil. So these are just little basil seedlings that I've hardened off. These I started on January 25th. And I'm just gonna plant this one between these two tomatoes and this one between these two tomatoes. And this variety is called Monteverde basil. It's supposed to not bolt as quickly. So bolting happens when a plant grows very quickly and kind of goes to the end stage of its life cycle and ends up setting seed. It's very fragrant already. And planting them with the tomatoes not only helps deter pests a bit because the basil is so fragrant, but also makes it pretty convenient when it comes to harvesting in the summertime because you're typically harvesting basil with tomatoes. Okay. So when it comes to watering, you want to make sure that the first 2 inches of soil are pretty moist, especially when they start to establish. My garden is all on drip irrigation, but when I initially plant something, I want to make sure it's really well watered. And if you're not on drip irrigation like me, you want to make sure you water at the base of the plant. You see how I'm not getting the tomato plant all wet? Because that can encourage mold and fungus and other sort of things that you don't want to happen. So a little bit of water on the leaves is okay, but you don't want to just like douse the top of the plant. We're really just trying to get the roots nice and wet. And then another tip for avoiding mold and fungus is also watering in the morning. So you don't want to water your plants at night typically. And I set my drip irrigation fairly low so then I can always supplement with more water. Too much water can lead to root rot and some other issues. So there's definitely a sweet spot when it comes to watering. And then in the summertime, another way to help retain moisture in your soil as well as combat with weeds would be to apply some mulch. And I still have some mulch here from last season. Mulch can be as simple as some dead leaves or dried leaves, straw. I like cedar mulch. I like the way that it looks and the way that it smells, but you can do quite a few different things when it comes to mulch. But when it comes to mulch, make sure that you're using respiratory protection, especially when you first open the bag. Sometimes there can be mold spores in the mulch and you don't want to breathe those in. I'll sometimes see people online shoveling mulch and it can be quite dangerous. So just make sure you exercise some precaution. So I'm taking some of this old mulch that was already here and just kind of spreading it around. It's not too hot here yet. I think today's high is gonna be, I think 65. So I'm not too worried about mulching this a whole lot right now. Okay. And then lastly, you want to have some sort of staking, trellis, cage, ladder for your tomatoes. I like to use tomato ladders like this. They're really compact. They help with more vertical growth, but I also like just conventional tomato cages as well. And getting these tomatoes in the ground really makes me feel like spring is officially here. All right, that's it. That's how I plant my tomatoes. We're gonna can kumquats. And I'm gonna be using my trusty Ball Complete Book of Home Preserving Cookbook. So when it comes to canning and preserving at home, it is so important that you use a trusted recipe. Don't just follow some recipe that you follow online. A USDA approved recipe is great. They have a ton of resources on their website. A lot of colleges or universities have extension programs where you can follow recipes. I also just love this cookbook because it has a ton of recipes for things that I grow in my garden, especially for lesser known fruits such as kumquats. So today I am going to be preserving these kumquats. I have not gotten around to really using these this season. I think I only made one dessert from them, but with preserving them, we can then make desserts year round. So a little bit about kumquats. So kumquats, I like to grow these in containers. They do really well. They're pretty well established in my garden. I like to call them nature's Sour Patch Kids because the rind, the skin is sweet, but the inside is tart. So sweet on the outside, tart on the inside. You eat the whole thing whole, and it's kind of like a fun little sour candy almost. And they're really good in desserts. I like to sometimes puree them. You can make cocktails from them. I've had a really good kumquat margarita before. And today, the recipe that we're gonna be following is from this cookbook, and we're gonna be preserving them in cinnamon syrup. So not only are the kumquats gonna get infused with cinnamon, but they're also gonna provide a really nice kumquat cinnamon syrup so that you could use the syrup for things, you can use the kumquats for things. But first I'm gonna give you a little overview of some of the essentials. So for today, we're gonna be needing a lot of sugar. We're gonna be using 6 cups of sugar. We have our kumquats, we've got our cinnamon sticks, and then you can find your basic canning kit online pretty inexpensively or at your local craft store usually. And it usually comes with a funnel, tongs, a magnetic lid lifter. This thing gets air bubbles out of your canning jar, and then a can lifter. And that's basic supplies. The other thing is you want to make sure you get legitimate ball mason jars. There's a lot of counterfeit jars out there on the market. Sometimes even you can go search online and say ball canning jar, and what shows up at your house is not a ball canning jar, it's some off-brand one. So I actually order my ball canning jars from Uline in bulk, a bunch of different sizes. I place a big order at the beginning of every year. And for today, we're gonna be using the 1 cup size. So this is a step down from your typical mason jar that you might see that's the pint size. So this is a 1 cup ball canning jar. I like to have 4 ounce, 8 ounce, pint, and then quart. Those are the 4 sizes that I like. Sometimes I like wide mouth jars or the narrow neck jars. These are just the standard neck jars. The quart size and the pint size come in 2 different neck sizes, and that's kind of up to you what your preference is. Another thing that's really nice to have is a scale, especially when you're preserving produce from the garden, to make sure that you are accurately following the recipe. So it's really important that you follow the recipe to a T to make sure you're being safe. And then for this recipe, we'll need a little bit of baking soda and a colander. This recipe calls for 2.5 pounds of kumquats, so we're gonna measure these out first. Perfect. And then we're gonna combine the kumquats with baking soda. So the baking soda is gonna clean off the kumquats. We're gonna be putting some boiling water over the kumquats with this baking soda, and then we'll rinse them off. So we're doing 2 tablespoons of baking soda. And we're gonna let these sit for 5 minutes in the baking soda boiling water. In this pot, I've got water, my jars, lids, and lid rings. And we're just gonna get this going at a low simmer while we prep the kumquats. So we're pricking these kumquats twice with a toothpick. This will help them prevent from bursting when we go to candy them in the cinnamon syrup. The variety of kumquat that I grow is not seedless, so these do have seeds in them. So when I do go to use them for other baked goods, I will probably still have to cut them open and remove the seeds or make a puree from them. Now it's time to make our cinnamon kumquat syrup. So I'm gonna add 6 cups of water. Mason jars also make good for measuring cups, so this is 4 cups. And then I'm gonna be adding 2 cinnamon sticks in here as well. And we're gonna bring this to a boil before adding the sugar. So we're gonna add 6 cups of sugar to our kumquats. I let them kind of stew with the cinnamon sticks. It did not come to a boil. It just I brought it to a boil and then kind of cut the heat down just below a simmer. So canning and preserving is one of those skills that you kind of add to your repertoire when you first start gardening. It's how you manage big gluts of fruit and vegetables and herbs. It's also a really nice way to stock up on homemade gifts. So it's definitely one of the things that I always have in my pantry so I can grab a gift and go. Some of my favorite things are marmalades, herb infused mustards are really fun to make as well. And these candied kumquats will be fun to give to people. Okay, and we're just heating this up until the sugar dissolves fully. All right, I'm gonna now remove our jars and lids. This is why you have multiple tools. The tongs probably will be easier. This smells so good. It feels very like festive almost. So the method that we're going to be using today is water bath canning, which is when you fill up these jars, we're gonna put the lids on, and you always wanna make sure you have brand new lids when it comes to canning. And we're just going to boil the jars. This is suitable for higher acid foods, but not suitable for low acid foods. If you wanna can low acid foods, you need a pressure canner. And always, again, use a tested, reliable recipe. And I'm just gonna get these jars nice and close to our kumquats, and we're going to ladle in first the kumquats, so evenly kind of distribute these between the jars, and then we'll ladle the syrup on top. So I'm first gonna start off with just 1 spoonful of kumquats per each, just to see kind of where we're at. This smells really good. And so now we've got that cinnamon kumquat syrup that we're gonna ladle over these. And the nice thing also about this funnel is if you fill it to the bottom of the funnel, that's about the amount of headspace that we're gonna want here. And then with this tool, we're gonna try and get any sort of air bubbles out. We also wanna push the kumquats down. We want them to be submerged in that water syrup liquid. So this helps to get any bubbles out that are at the bottom, and that can help in the canning process. If there's an improper seal, the lid won't seal and there'll be a bubble. So we want to make sure we get all those air bubbles out and pushing those kumquats down a little bit. And then we put the lids on. So I just wiped all of the rims clean. Make sure there's no sugar syrup on them, which can also prevent a good seal. So like I said, every time you can something, you want to use brand new lids of these. You can reuse these, but you want to make sure you get brand new ones. These rings basically just make it so then the lids stay in place while you're canning, and they're actually meant to be removed after the canning process. And we're not going to screw them too tight. You can see, like, just to a little bit tightness here. There we go. Perfect. Then we're going to put these back into our water bath canner here. We're going to increase the heat to a boil and process these for 15 minutes. And then a trick for keeping hard water spots off your cans is I just like to add a splash of vinegar. All right. Those processed for 15 minutes, and we're going to remove them from the canner. So when these are properly canned, after cooling down, the lid should be popped down, so you shouldn't be able to press on it and it bounce up and down. If it does bounce up and down, either consume what's in the jar immediately or discard it for best safety. And then also when these are cooled down, I'm going to attach a label to each jar with the date and what's inside of it. And you'll have to stay tuned to see what I make with all these little golden nuggets. I'll see you next time.